played my fair share of Skyrim, I knew nothing of the Fallout series. That is, until the TV show. And I think that the Fallout series excels at drawing the viewer in, and rather than avoiding world building and running on the fumes of a past franchise, the Fallout TV series is a masterclass in bringing the viewer in from the mundane and into the fantastical. So stay a while and listen. The first reason the Fallout TV show did such a good job at introducing the world to a new viewer to reveal their world building is their choice of main character. Lucy is inexperienced, and this is supremely helpful for introducing a secondary world. Think about the Hobbit book as an example. Bilbo Baggins as a main character is perfect for entering into a fantastical world because Bilbo starts in a world that is fairly familiar. It's British countryside-esque, and he's going to enter into a world of elves and dwarves and goblins and talking eagles and dragons. And so because Bilbo himself is so sheltered, as he learns about the world, we as readers also learn about the world. Similarly, Lucy as a main character is supremely sheltered and inexperienced, which doesn't mean unskilled. The TV show establishes a skill set. She comes from a very scientific community. She's been trained in some ground hand-to-hand combat. She has some training with the firearms. She says she doesn't have a good aim, but still, having some firearm experience is certainly better than having zero. And that little bit of experience will come into play later. But perhaps her greatest skill, if you will, is her chipper can-do attitude, which creates a great amount of resilience when she enters into the outer world. But because Lucy has been stuck underground and has never exited out, when she does, she is experiencing the outer world for the first time and is learning things, as do we. We learn along with her. What this prevents is a very clunky way of dropping world building, the as you know conversations, where characters speak to each other about things they already know and really have no in-character, in-universe reason for talking in this way, but are simply dropping information for the benefit of the viewer or the reader. So as you know, Bob.
And they imbued her with the power of a demon. Thusly, the first slayer of the vampires was born.
That's, really great. We actually know all of that.
Right? So they have these conversations that sound, a lot like those really clunky radio advertisements. Did you know that there is a sale on at X and Y store?
Yes. And did you know that the sale is on all this week for only $79.99?
Nobody talks like that. And in a movie or a TV show, it's a really clunky way of dropping information. So the far superior option is to have an inexperienced character that can learn about the world the viewer does as well. And in fact, it's not just Lucy that is the inexperienced character. The character Maximus is an apprentice. He has experience of the greater outer world, but it's through the eyes of an apprentice that we learn about the entire system of this Brotherhood of Steel, the hierarchy of the Brotherhood of Steel, their justice system,
and how one climbs up the ranks of their organization.
The second way that Fallout is really good at world building is, I could call stealth world building. One of the attractions of science fiction and fantasy is exploring strange secondary worlds. So two equal and opposite mistakes are, one, info dumping, which is when the story stops and you have characters sit around explaining how things work, literally dumping information on the reader or viewer. Or two, to do no world building whatsoever, either out of sheer laziness, because it's just fantasy anyways, or out of a misguided sense that politics is boring. The good fantasy and the good science fiction world builds naturally through the conflicts of the story, through a character's real conflicts, their desires, and it flows naturally from the story itself. Fallout is stealthily sneaking in their world building. It's really efficient world building where they just drop in conversation and move on. And as a viewer, you're hardly even noticing because they're not stopping to explain things, but hints are being dropped along the way. Think about the opening scenes. A TV is playing and they're talking about a missing president, and that gets turned off. And another TV is playing, talking about nuclear warfare. That gets turned off. And so you're paying attention to the new scenery, this California party up in the hills. But in two very brief TV clip dialogues, we're establishing a Cold War-esque world. And what about the people we are introduced to? What is their reaction to it? Try and forget about it. Let's have a party. We're not going to pay attention to the impending dangers that is besetting our society. Furthermore, the opening event or conflict for Lucy is a matter of marriage between one vault and another, post-bomb. And that entire section is rife with world building. You never feel like the story is being stopped and you're getting lectured to about how everything works. As the characters are going about their life, you learn, oh, there's these different vaults underground. They have limited connection with each other, but in order for genetic diversity, there's these marriage exchanges underground. And just in passing conversation along the hallway, you learn there's some issues with cousins, and there is actually a serious danger of genetic inbreeding. The fact that you have to apply to get married, like a job interview, tells you a lot about their society. And while that only reveals one small part that allows the viewer to expand and extrapolate out what the rest of the society must be like. And all this is just dropped in and moved on. The show was also very effective on that first episode in conveying something is not right with this new group. And on first watch, I had this feeling something was off about them, but I couldn't quite place exactly why I had that feeling. I mean, there was some very obvious, ominous shots of empty hallways while this marriage ceremony is going on, which was really laying it on thick at that point. But rewatching it, as the marriage ceremony is going on, there's some very deliberate, long shots on both the leader of the supposed Vault 32 and on, I want to call him Nose because Ender's Game, Norm. There's an off vibe on it, for one. Two, it's just in passing. They don't make a big deal of it, but it's one of those things that they put these clues in, you probably subconsciously get it. The behaviors of these other supposed vault dwellers is off. There's one woman that is holding the knife all wrong and stabs food off of the plate of an actual vault dweller and starts eating it directly off the knife. That seems off when the vault dwellers of Vault 33 have been demonstrated to be very square, very genteel to some extent. Similarly, there's a passing pan shot where there's these hidden tattoos on one of the groups, scars on the back of her head, which again, everything about the Vault 33, they're far too conformist for tattoos. Not a collection of people that you would expect to be wearing tattoos. Even some of the long shots on Martin and his facial expressions, but especially the leader and of Nose. Norm. All significant clues that something is off. Incidentally, other great hints of future reveals. When you look at the fight scene, who decides to fight, like actually fight amongst Vault 33, is aligned not just with their own characters, but also those that came from Vault 31 are the ones that are active and willing to fight. Steph Harper, that loses an eye, the father, they're the ones that stand and fight. The ones that cower, are subservient, are from Vault 33. Very subtle, something that you wouldn't necessarily pay attention to on the first viewing, but then once you get to the later reveals, yes, this is just good foreshadowing, but it's world building at the same time. The writer has been teaching you about the world and you don't even realize it. That's perfection. It's a very well crafted story. Third and finally, I have since discovered, now that I've played a whole bunch of Fallout 4, that it's a rather insane universe. There's a lot of pretty wacky things in a universe in which life sucks and then you die. But the TV show does such a good job of starting you small, starting with the mundane, the familiar, and then dropping you into stranger and weirder territories. This too is what The Hobbit does so well, right? Like Tolkien begins in countryside Britain, effectively, with the Shire, and they venture forth and run into trolls. That's kind of strange, that's kind of crazy, but they're fairly easily handled by Gandalf. And they arrive upon the last homely house, on the edge of the wilderness, on the border between the mundane and the fantastic. And then from there, it gets stranger and weirder till you get to Mirkwood and Fairyland, where things are not always as they seem. You might see lights and feastings in the distance there, but then they vanish and disappear, and reappear somewhere else. Where goblins and orcs roam, where dragons sit on buried treasure. We start with the familiar, we start with the mundane world, and then dive deeper into the fantastical. Same too with Fallout. Where does Fallout begin? It's something that is vaguely 1950s America. It's a little bit different, but there's some very familiar signs and signifiers. You have the all-American cowboy that's entertaining for this crowd of wealthy Americans. You have the threat of nuclear warfare and slurs of pinkos. This feels very Cold War-esque. We know this story. This is very familiar. And even when the nuclear bombs go off, this is a story that has been told many times before, living in the nuclear fallout. The only difference now is we have the technology to show the spectacle of these nuclear bombs going off. And man, what a spectacle. But this is the familiar, the mundane, and the writer builds trust with the viewer and builds out their world, expands it. So then we enter into the vault. It's a bit stranger. There's an artificiality to the world. You can see that there's projectors that are projecting this very beautiful, ideal countryside. There's a bit of the Truman Show to it. But even still, although they're living in a vault and that is more into the fantastical, the images being portrayed, aside from everyone's living in suits, feels familiar. It's a little more fantastic. We've got these technologies around their wrists that are kind of clunky, and we're clearly living in a post-nuclear warfare environment, but it's here where the writer builds the groundwork and establishes trust with the viewer, that they've thought through this world. We have a character we care about in Lucy, and then things take a turn. Raiders strike Vault 33, disguised as other Vault dwellers, and we turn it up a notch. The fight scene is kind of crazy. It's brutal, it's violent. There's this idyllic life under the vault, and we were warned what the outsiders were like. That it sucks. And sure enough, these raiders, they come from above. And what do? They bring death and violence. And then that transitions to our introduction of Maximus, who does live on the surface, and we discover, oh yes, it is a barren wasteland out there. And what is our very first scene with Maximus? It's him getting beat up by another group of apprentices. They're on latrine duty. Life on the surface is nasty, brutish, and short. Life sucks on the top surface, and people are violent. And now we introduce a new, more fantastical thing. Instead of being a post-apocalyptic vault where people are living in a semi-scientific community, instead we have post-apocalyptic semi-sci-fi knights. The Brotherhood of Steel. We're, again, turning it up, making it more fantastic. We've established trust, and so now we can get weirder, wackier. And what do we have? These giant hover ships and quadcopters would turn it up again. Then we reveal just how large these vaults are, how destructive it was outside it, these frozen in time remnants of a previous nuclear blast. And then we get to the strangest. There are ghouls that live among men. They wait until the very end of the show to introduce the idea of dead people walking around that have personalities. Playing through Fallout, I now realize, oh, there's ghouls, feral, some are sentient, there's also these big ogre-like creatures. There's all sorts of bizarre and strange things. And honestly, the more I've played the Fallout game, the more I appreciate just how well they're adapting the idea, the feel, the atmosphere of the game. They knew they had to get to the crazy, insane world of Fallout. But where did they start? They started with what was familiar, what was mundane. They built trust. They dropped stealth bits of world building throughout efficiently. They gave us a inexperienced character through whose eyes we can learn the rest of the world. And when they established that trust, they could turn up the fantastical just a bit more. And then they end, boom, ghouls walk these lands. It's amazing. I love it. In a time in which a lot of very well established intellectual properties have been a very frustrating or depressing experience, I'm very much enjoying how we're getting new intellectual properties that have been properly thought out. There are some proper storytellers that are willing to bring secondary worlds to light and treat them with the respect that they deserve. And the more we can see of that, the better off we'll all be, because I like secondary world stories. Take me to the weird and the wacky, but do a good job. Take the craziness of a fantastical world seriously. Anyways, that's all for now.
Love it.